Well, one of the last main components to biblical sermon is illustration, right? So as we're talking about cross-cultural communications, and we're wrestling with this idea of how do we build a biblical sermon, how do we build a biblical idea and a lesson that we can teach that transcends cultures, that doesn't matter where we are, we can read and understand. Then, man, illustration is the last kind of major step of that. And can I just say, never underestimate the power of a powerful illustration. I can think back literally in my head to sermons that I've heard decades ago. And it's not, I can remember with vivid pictures and understanding. It's not because I have a great memory, because I don't, right? But it's because the illustrations were so powerful. Right? Maybe you can do the same. Think back for a second to a powerful sermon that you heard. What was the illustration that drove it, right? Unfortunately, even though we know that there's power in good illustrations, we often fail to give proper time to developing illustrations well. So let me give you a couple reasons to consider why illustrations are important, right? The reasons we do this. There's a lot of different things. First is, the audience is just not wired for lectures, right? Due to technology, to entertainment, many other things. Like, our audiences most of the time aren't wired for long, information-heavy discussions. Like, they just don't want to hear it. They're not used to paying attention to it. So they need things like stories and examples and pictures to engage and understand a message. So no matter if it's a seminary class lecture like what we're doing here, or if I'm in person, or if I'm preaching a sermon to 1,000 people, or I'm just at dinner with friends, like, we have to vary the way that we communicate, and illustrations help us do that. Illustrations are also important because people think differently, right? Some people need pictures in order to learn, right? This is what we call, there's I don't know how much you know, and I don't want to get too much into biology, right? But there's a right brain, and there's a right side of your brain and a left side of your brain. And when one of the two is dominant, then we process information differently, right? And so we have to pay attention to those sorts of things. We need pictures in order to learn, right? Illustrations are the best tool to communicate with people who specifically are right-brained. They're more creative. They're less analytical. That's more of the left brain side of things. So the illustrations are incredibly important for those on the creative side of things. We also see that there's illustrations infuse emotional charge into the sermon, right? Finding powerful illustrations. They kind of just insert, right? They infuse, they embed our sermons with this emotional charge. And what happens is this emotion then connects the message, it connects to the culture, it connects to the audience, and illustrations generate an interest that bland content cannot create. Like, you can try to make your lecture exciting, right? But I'm telling you, you're going to fail. So illustrate the point. Illustrations are especially helpful when the preacher must explain complex theological issues. So when we're really in the weeds of a really complex theological issue, if we can find the perfect illustration, it helps us to mitigate the complexity, because illustrations serve as pictures that help clarify our points. So they come in a lot of different forms. We can use stories, we can use object lessons, we can use quotations, personal observations, and many other things to use for illustrations. So how do we find them, right? We're like, that was a why. Why do we need them? Now it's a like, how do we find illustrations? Let me give you some ideas. First, you can just tell personal stories. Right? These stories always connect, in my experience. They always connect with the audience because they reveal real life. So this is real me. This happened to me this week, right? Too many personal stories, however, can grow really stale. So if I, every week at every point in the sermon, I say, oh, there was a time in my life when I did this, right? Then everybody's like, oh, great, here's preacher story time again, right? And if we tell too many personal stories, frankly, you become less believable, right? Because you're putting yourself as, I'm the perfect Christian, right? And nobody wants to hear that, right? So you can tell personal stories, but be careful not to tell too many stories. And when you're telling personal stories, don't make them up, right? Don't lie to your audience, right? You can't be the preacher that lies in a sermon. So don't make something up. If it's not true, if it didn't actually happen, then don't tell it, right? Don't make it up. You can also find illustrations in books, really good books. Like there's tons of content from what we learn. You can recall clips, scenes in movies or TV shows, right? This kind of feeds our normal like pop culture. This is something that people understand. Everybody, if there's a TV show or a news broadcast or something happened on that everybody's seen and everybody knows and everybody's talking about, you can use that, and that's perfectly fine, right? We have to be careful when we're talking about television and movies specifically, because sometimes we'll use we'll use a clip from a movie or tell a story from a movie, and we think that's the perfect story, right? But the overall theme of the movie isn't all that great, right? So, but if we use it, that it kind of shows up as an endorsement of that movie, or whatever's unhealthy in that. So just be careful with that. But occasionally they're great to use. We can also use observations and conversations. So things like, hey, I was talking with a friend of mine last week and I said this, right? That's perfectly fine. If you tell a story about somebody else, like make sure you get their permission, just by the way, right? You don't want them to be mad at you. You don't want other people going, oh, did you hear about Pastor Cameron? He was telling you, he was telling about this when you fell off the boat and you said these bad words, right? Don't do that without permission. Let me give you a few more ways to find illustrations. You can just simply borrow illustrations. And when I was in seminary, this is the way my professor always just said. He said, "Hey, there's no plagiarism with the illustrations." He said they're fair game, right? So you can steal somebody's illustration if somebody else tells a story, and you're like, "That's an incredible story." Like you use the same story, right? But be careful to give credit where it's due. So if you have a friend that says something really wise, like, and you want to pull from that, pull it and say it. But just say, hey, I have a friend that said this, right? Or just like I just said, my preaching professor told me this, right? So just give credit where it's due. Make sure you don't tell somebody else's story as your own. So if something happened to your brother-in-law, say, oh, this happened to my brother-in-law, right? With his permission, of course, right? So you can borrow illustrations. You can also just use your imagination, like be creative. Like you can make up virtually anything, and that's okay. Again, don't present it as truth if it's not true. Just say, I was thinking the other day, what if this happened? And you just present this hypothetical situation. You can do that. That's perfectly fine. You can also find illustrations just literally by research and hard work, paying attention to what's around you, researching an idea or a concept or whatever it may be. And maybe lastly, you can just kind of surf the web, right? Get your phone out, ask ChatGPT. That's perfectly okay. I would just encourage you, if you do that, to make sure you check your sources, right? You don't want to tell an illustration that ChatGPT just made up, and you don't want to say, oh yeah, the president of such and such country once said this, and ChatGPT just totally made that up. So make sure you check your sources to make sure it's said, and those sorts of things. So there's lots and lots and lots of ways to find illustrations. So we want to do the illustrations. We know how now, maybe a little bit better how to find them. Now, how do we actually do it? How do we use them? So there's some connections and transitions, right? So we want to connect dots and we want to transition from points to points. So let the biblical text drive the sermon. We've said this over and over and over and over. When the Bible says it, that's what we want to pin down. So we let the text drive the sermon and build the points, right? So we don't build a sermon around an illustration. So you hear a great story and you're like, oh, that would be a powerful illustration. You don't build the sermon to illustrate the illustration, right? That's absurd. Let the biblical text drive the sermon. Then you let the illustration create the movement in the sermon, right? So the anticipation, the fear, the emotion. You remember we said this kind of helps tie emotions to things, right? So we let the illustration create some movement in the sermon. We're flowing through our sermon. You can also let the illustration serve as a transition, right? A transition is the logical, natural movement from one idea within a sermon to another idea in the sermon. So pull your points together through an illustration. Let it be your transition. How do we evaluate illustrations? This is another how do we know when it's good, right? We have to evaluate its effectiveness. If it's not a good story, it's not a good story. I literally, like just a couple weeks ago, used an illustration in my sermon, and I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was funny. It was short, and it was widely misunderstood, and it was not effective at all. And so you're going to do that sometimes. Let me give you some ideas of how do we evaluate some things, right? So avoid bizarre, anything that's really weird, the coarse things that may be a little bit off color, maybe right on the line of what's appropriate and inappropriate, anything super grotesque. Like, we just don't want to go there. Like, nobody wants to go there, so just don't go there, right? Don't tell a really gross story. Nobody cares about that. Like, nobody wants to see that, right? You want to remember that stories have power to stimulate the imagination. So tap into the emotion of things. This is we want to do it. We want to stimulate. So we're asking ourselves, does this stimulate my imagination? We also want to avoid insensitive illustrations. So what is insensitive? There's a lot of things that are really insensitive, that are difficult. Politics, war, traumatic events, right? Any of those things, anything that could create controversy, anything that could create isolation, or even just something that would be hurtful to an audience member, like to somebody there. You don't want to go there, right? It's too much, because it would just be insensitive. Like, you wouldn't be paying attention to your audience. When it comes to length of illustrations, how do we use them? Like, let me just give you some ideas. Be brief and to the point. Like, don't just go on and on and on and on, telling all these extra details. Really, as you prepare, this is part of really crafting a good illustration. Get succinct. Like, what are the facts that really need to know, and all of the things that they don't need to know, don't worry about them. And let them, as much as possible, be closely tied to the biblical point. Right? It's the hardest part about using an illustration, especially if it's a personal story. Because what happens is we tend to linger, we tend to give too much information, and here's what happens. All it does is it confuses everyone. It takes away from the primary goal, which is the text, and it just adds confusion. So be brief, to the point, closely tied to the biblical points. Now the question is, how many should we use? Like, there's no hard, fast rule. There's no way to say you should have 1 illustration per sermon or 7 illustrations per sermon. At a minimum, generally speaking, right, we should have no more than 1 illustration per point, maybe another illustration per introduction and conclusion. Everybody's a little bit different. Kind of depends on the length, the time that you have for your sermon, the text that you're preaching, all of those things, right? Personally, I try to keep to 1 to 2 really powerful illustrations per sermon. So if I'm preaching for 30 minutes, I try to think 1, maybe 2, sometimes 3, but I try to keep it as little as possible, but I really, really work hard to make sure that they're really powerful, especially if I'm preaching a narrative passage, because when you're in a narrative passage, which is a lot of the Old Testament, the passage itself is kind of a story anyways, right? So if the text is a bunch of story and then I'm telling a whole bunch of stories, then it's just, there's a lot. Or like, what do we actually do? So we skip the illustration, we focus more on the application than the illustration. But 1 to 2 illustrations is kind of where I really look if they're really, really good ones. So all in all, illustrations are just like everything else in cross-cultural communications, right? They take time, they take practice. We've got to evaluate. It takes a lot of intentionality, but we want to do them, and we want to do them on purpose, and we want to do them as best as we can. And here's what's awesome about it is we want to watch for the response, and we want to just keep going and going and going. It's a really small step, but it's one of the most powerful tools. Illustration is incredibly powerful. If you remember when I broke down a sermon into 3 little bitty steps, right? Explanation, illustration, application. Like it's that powerful. It's that important. And it will come alive. It will help this text come alive for your audience. So one more topic. The last video in this class is on delivery.